Back in my day, there was this thing called the Rubik's Cube. It was a puzzle that you twisted and turned to get all the colors to one side and to make a beautiful pattern where all the colors aligned. And it seemed like no matter how you twisted or turned, it would just lead to utter frustration and seemed impossible to solve. It seemed like almost that you needed to be a magician and have a magic trick to do it. However, what you discovered was that there was a pattern, that there was a system into doing it. And once you learned that pattern and system, it would take you mere seconds to solve. And you would never have to use anything else to do it. It could be jumbled as much as possible, and still, if you use the system, you'll solve it. In writing, there's something similar called the 3-act structure. The 3-act structure is a system that's designed to help you tell your story. Most stories, if not all, have a 3-act structure. It's the how you get to the 3-act structure that's the interesting part in writing, because not everybody does it the same. There are many methods that you can use to get to the 3-act structure, and that is what this show is about, as we take a look at how you develop your own 3-act structure that works for you.
Oh, hi, I'm Nikki Hicks, and I write basically just weird fiction, pulp, noir, science fiction, fantasy, whatever you need. I'm pretty much a war whore. So whatever you give me a contract for, I'll write. That's what I write.
Hey guys, I am Alexander Gideon. I write everything from sci-fi to historical fantasy, epic fantasy, sci-horror. My first book in the Books of the Law series from Falstaff Books, A Web of Crimson, came out back in April. Second book is stuck in editing hell, so it should be out at some point, probably next year. It is about, featured Aleister Crowley as the main character, and it entails him investigating a mystical cult who is trying, who they believe is trying to take over the British Empire.
I am ERIK Christopher Myers. I am a Pisces. I have never had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich in my life. I know. I'm an autism acceptance advocate. I'm also a filmmaker. I have directed the features Roulette and Butterfly Kisses. I also write film criticism for Ain't It Cool News, typically under the topics of franchise history and genre theory.
Hi, I'm Julie HINER. I actually do two things, and I always talk about the one. Right now I'm focused on killersanddemons.com, where I serve up a toxic cocktail of 80s metal and murder. It's all dark crime and horror. But where I started actually was Just a Girl and a Bike, and it's an inspirational believe in yourself book. And I'm starting to now think I need to find a way to either do both or merge them into one spot, because the bike book is a good book. It's an inspirational thing, and it's a fundraiser. So I've kind of dropped it to seek this dark fiction path. But now that that's starting to go, I'm going to need to find a way to bring them together, I think.
Hi, I am Megan Morgan. I am the author of The Altered Wake and also The Altered Rise, which is also stuck in editing hell and will hopefully be released someday soon. And I also have 2 short stories in the book In the Blink of an Eye, based off of Butterfly Kisses by ERIK Christopher Myers. It's a very cool anthology about Blink Man.
When should we really be thinking about our endings? When's a good time to really start plotting and planning the end?
I think I mentioned on one of the last shows that I was on that I'm thinking about the end from the first moment that I start writing. I usually have at least some kind of an endpoint in mind. It can sometimes shift a little bit, but it's always there, because I think that, for me anyway, I like to know like where the characters are going.
I'm the same way. Like, I don't completely 100% set it in stone, but I do know where it's going. Most of my books, whether they be or stories, spun on some kind of serial killer or monster, and I'm talking like the Ted Bundy's kind of guys. So they have a pretty clear fantasy and end goal, and it really makes them unravel. And then similarly, the detective or whoever the other person is, they unravel as well, because I write dark, I write noir, and it's going to end bad. But I just need to know at least pretty much where it's going. Otherwise, I don't know how I would get there. But I know other people do it differently, so that's just how it works for me.
Same thing for me. I know the beginning and I have an idea of the end. The end can move around, but I need something to shoot for when you're in the middle of all that squishy middle bit. You've got to have something to shoot for. So I need to know at least an idea of what my ending is.
Honestly, it really depends on what I'm writing. With the short stories that I've got in the Zombies Need Brains anthology, it's definitely knew my ending when I started writing. In fact, when I write short stories, the first things that I write are the first line and the last line, and I make sure that they are as strong as each other. That you start off with a hook that's going to make a slush reader want to keep going, and you end with that last like punch. But when I was writing Web of Crimson and the next book in the series, I know my endings before I start really writing, but I allow the ending to kind of happen organically as I'm planning, because I'm a hardcore planner for pretty much everything, and when I plot out the story, I kind of, as I'm following the structure of the acts and everything, I let where the story is going kind of happen naturally. And of course, it changes from the plan after that as well. Sometimes it doesn't work out quite as well once you're into it and you've got all your dialogue and all of your motivations and everything. But I like to allow that to happen as I'm planning it.
Yeah, I know Mr. Gideon and I did a little bit of wiffle ball on this subject on a previous episode. So with that being said, I plan nothing. I do not want to know the ending, because I found that when I do know the ending, everything feels forced and contrived to reach that point, and characters begin wanting to make their own decisions, that I'm smacking their hands and saying, stop that, stop thinking for yourself. And the story becomes less compelling. I will never have, as a viewer, the experience that everybody else will have sitting down and watching that film. So for me, it's the writing, and I want to be shocked by everything that unfolds. And I can't wait to get to the ending, just as much as hopefully everybody watching the film can't wait to get to the ending.
So that being said, with your ending, if you get to a point, like let's say you're at like page 50 and you've come up with the idea of where the ending is coming from, do you then abandon everything you're doing, or do you restructure it and rewrite it so that you get, like if you get to 75 and you have an idea of the ending, then that's probably where you want to be. Is that fair to say for you?
It's interesting, because as I will start to get a sort of vague sense of where the story is going. Mm-hmm. I might have an idea of where it's going to end, but I never say, okay, that's it, and I am now committing to it. I want to see, if I get there, how closely it is when I reach that point, and what characters decide along the way. So yeah, I might get a sense of it, but I never restrain the choices that I'm allowing the characters to make. I basically create the world, and then I say, okay, you all have free will, but I'm going to keep throwing problems at you because I've got this page count. And I just let it unfold. The most recent script I wrote, I literally had no idea as I approached page 90 how it was going to end. And so I was sitting here at my computer chewing my nails, waiting to see how it would come together. And I really dug it. I really liked what happened at the very end.
So in establishing an ending and figuring out where you are, wherever point you're at, whatever point you decide you're going to have this ending, and given that it might evolve, it might change, it might take a life on its own, how much pressure do you put on yourself when you're at the end? Do you trace back just to make sure that it's that it's tight enough to make that ending stick out?
I have found in everything that I've written so far that as I get to the end, I can feel it. And so there is 100% this sense, if you have built everything up correctly before that point, that there will be a feeling in the pages of that, build towards the final climax and the denouement, and it will become very, very insistent. And I think that that's when you know that everything before has worked well. And I have found, at least so far, that the most interesting thing is when you have a bunch of like what you think are like stray ends, and they sort of start locking into place in ways you didn't expect. And that, I always feel like, is the moment when, okay, I might not have known what those were for, and now I do, and they're sort of like all coming together, and things are starting to get crazy, and they're happening, and I'm there. And I think that the pacing just sort of, at least in my experience, it just happens naturally.
I actually, when I get to my third act, but basically when I hit that point where it's start of third act, I actually like to go back and do an edit on what I've got so far, just to read through it, make sure that I don't have any dangling threads that I've forgotten about this whole time. Because sometimes I'll do that. I'll add in this little point, or put Chekhov's gun on the mantelpiece.
Yeah, Chekhov's gun.
And have entirely meant to do something with that and had completely not planned it in what I was doing. But I do sometimes also like having those endings where it's kind of the culmination of what you deserve to have at the end. And sometimes you may know what's coming, but it's like you want to see how it happens. But there's a really good book that I read by a Japanese author. The book is called Another. And it's this kind of like horror mystery kind of thing. I'll actually use it as the basis for the ending of A Web of Crimson, because it was kind of an ending where you're like, by the end, you've kind of figured out, you're looking for one person. You're trying to figure out who this person is. And by the end, you're like, it's this person, because they're not thinking about it. And a lot of people that I know that have read it have all kind of latched onto that as well. But I like that last twist where it's like, yes, but did you know this person was this? It was kind of the where I went with that. And so that really kind of came about by going back and doing that edit and really seeing like, oh, I've kind of set this up this way so that I can have this little last twist, even though the ending is the ending you're expecting.
My influences, my inspirations are things like True Detective and Mindhunter, Red Dragon. So if you watch or read or both those things, like those endings take up they're very important. They need to be really scary. They need to be really dark. So I do flesh out the endings somewhat, meaning like I have an idea of, so I've got this serial killer, and what does his dungeon look like? What do his murder scenes look like? What do his victims look like? Why is he doing this? So I have a pretty dark idea of what he's doing at the end. And then what happens for me is when the detective actually gets there, I don't always know exactly what's going to happen to him until I start writing it and it comes out. So that's the fun part. But if I have a really clear idea of what he's stepping into, and then I can experience it through his eyes, then it can be really surprising for me. And the more, kind of terrified I am as I'm writing it, or when I go back and read it, if I think, oh my God, how did I write that? That's gross. Then that's great. That's exciting. And then I know, like, when I'm watching something that inspires me and I'm terrified, that's what I want to give my audience.
For me, that's almost like when the magic starts to happen when you start writing a story. Like my very favorite of the Jake stories is Golems, Goons, and Coldstone Bitches, mainly because I just started with an idea and I just let it unfold. It just unfolded, and the ending is so perfect. It's one of my favorite endings for all the Jake stories. But I didn't plan it. It just kind of happened, and the whole thing just kind of happened, and it felt like you said. I knew the ending. It just kind of boom. Okay, we're done. It was just a weird feeling, and I don't want to get all woo-woo about it, but there's just a feeling when you know things are happening in your story.
I will get woo-woo about it because sometimes it's crazy what happens when you get to the end and all of a sudden you're like, this character that's been off doing stuff like this whole time and you had no idea what it was for, and then all of a sudden like you're getting up to the ending and everything makes sense and you know where it's going and you know how to put it together and you're just like, wow, how did I do this? I don't know. Sometimes you don't even know, and that I think is a great sign.
How about for you, Eric? You know, as somebody who discovers the ending and is moving along with it, when you get to that point, do you often find that you're shifting scenes from the first two acts around because you've created the ending you've created?
I think it really depends upon genre. I think it depends a lot upon what story you're trying to tell. I personally, for whatever it's worth, don't believe that you can know the ending before you've taken the journey. Now, there are obviously exceptions. If it's Agatha Christie writing an Hercule Poirot novel, you know, you need to know who did it for the most part before you go into that story. However, if it's a Tom Clancy with a Jack Ryan story, that's going to be different. I tend to find that my endings come about in a very neat way, and I think that has a lot to do simply with the fact that my writing, my writing regimen is such that I have a set number of pages that I prescribe to myself every day. It doesn't matter if I'm sick. It doesn't matter if my car breaks down. I must reach that page count every day because I have a due date that I put on the calendar. And I have to treat this as if it were my job and as if I were writing for a studio or for whomever else, and there's no such thing as being late. And so as a result, what I do is I get up and I, very early in the morning, spew pages out. And then at the end of the day, sit down and refine the pages I just wrote. And so I'm constantly in a state of revision. And I think that part of my brain that is seeing how all of these pieces click and lock together is constantly ticking along because I'm not just, vomiting the draft. I'm refining it as it goes.
I mean, obviously, the end is the end, right? It's the conclusion. It's wrapping up a story. It's wrapping up the acts and putting it all together. But besides that, what are some things that you need to have in your end or your third act that you feel like are necessities that will help reach that conclusion? Is this something that you really feel like needs to be there other than, obviously, the end?
I am in that minority of people who enjoys ambiguity in a story, particularly as it wraps up. I don't want everything answered. That doesn't mean that I want plot holes. It doesn't mean that I want for there to be these huge gaping, breaks in logic or narrative. But I do like to be challenged to interpret what I saw and how it all came together. So, and I feel that happens in my own creation to a certain degree. I don't want to give you every single answer. I want you to talk about it when it's over and maybe to argue about it. And so I like to not give everything, even if I know the answers. I don't want to just spoon feed the audience.
I mean, it's a story arc of the character, where they began and where they ended. And the ending needs to feel genuine, needs to feel organic. It doesn't need to feel forced. I need to know that this is the same character, but not the same character. They've learned something, they've made friends, made enemies, whatever. But there's a story arc involved in every story. And that to me is very, very important, especially when it comes to an end of a story.
I am almost invariably writing stories in which a character is sort of confronting themselves. And so for me, the critical thing that I sort of need at the end of the book is not so much very often. Yes, there's this very exciting confrontation between like the main character and like the main antagonist. But very often the really key moment is the one when the character sort of confronts themselves. And that can be really difficult in like an action, sci-fi, or fantasy kind of world. You're not looking at your antagonist for that key critical moment. You're rather looking for something that's going to draw that out of the character.
Writing pulp historical urban fantasy featuring Aleister Crowley, there's some things that you kind of expect out of an ending. And I think the number one thing that I put into an ending for one of those books is just the magic. Because, you have Aleister Crowley, who is, famous for his work with high magic and that kind of thing and the occult. And so, when you're reading an urban fantasy featuring him, you're like, what you want at the end of the book is this big magical battle. And of course, you're going to have that throughout the book. You know, it's not going to be the first time or the only time that he uses this magic in the book. That's kind of a point of contention between me and my editor for the second book, because I'm basically in the process of convincing her that the conflict at the end is the conflict that's been going on through the whole book, and it's really like doing some more work to see that end, just to make sure that it's working there. But I do also like having that extra, like, which probably my last chapter of the book is always that same kind of thing where you've gotten through your conflict, it's over, and now you have that reestablishment of the norm. This is the new norm after all of this has happened. So you have that kind of breath at the end of the book for everyone to kind of take stock of what has happened and to figure out what's going forward. And a lot of times I kind of go ahead and give a little bit of what's going to happen in the next book in that ending, which is a privilege that I've got because I knew that I had 4 books in this season. We do them as seasons, and we bundled them all as a single collection, as like one book after 4 of them have come out. So I had the pleasure of knowing that I'm, when I write book 1, I've got a book 2 and a 3 and a 4. So I'm able to kind of seed that in a little bit more than you would if, I was in a big publisher and they were like, you get 1 book and we'll decide whether or not you get another book after that one comes out.
For series and sequels and things of that nature, your second book, did you have a different approach to writing the ending than you did the first one?
So my approach for the second book was a little bit different. I basically thought of A Web of Crimson, the first book, as the establishment of the world and the character. And book 2 was the establishment of the main conflict of the entire series, where it was the first book started it, but you don't, you end with this shadowy figure and you're like, who is this person? What are they doing? What do they want? And book 2 is finding out who they are and what they want. But it also depends, that kind of gets into like the nitty gritty of publishing, really. How you should approach that it's going to depend a lot on who you're publishing with. If you are with a small publisher who may be more willing to give you multiple books or, give you a 3-4 book deal, then you're able to, sign that contract and then know you've got those books. But if you're going to New York, you may get 2 books. Maybe you may get 2 books. You may only sign a contract for 1 book. So really how you end is going to depend on what your contract says and whether or not you're guaranteed more, or if it's going to be based on sales, whether you get more.
One thing that I really, really loved about the show Firefly for the 11 episode run that it had was that there were these really, really interesting sub arcs within larger arcs. And to me, that's sort of what I think about as I'm writing each book in a series. I want each book to be a sub arc within the larger arc. And so that to me, so yes, you're going to tie up some things at the end, but there are certain very specific things that you leave loose so that because those are your larger arc.
When I was writing the Jake Ishinheji stories, I always looked at it like it was like 3 braids. There's the main arc, the main plot line, and 2 other plot lines that kind of wove into each other. And by the end of it, they all wove together into 1 braid. However, I always left a little bit going so that it would interlock like a puzzle piece into the next story. Because it's almost like an old-timey pulpy serial kind of show where every story leads to the next story, which leads to the next story, which leads to the next story. Even if that story, say the one that's very Lovecraftian with all the deep ones and the fish people, they don't have a lot to deal with the alchemists and stuff, yet still it's still in the background. And it attaches to the next story.
I didn't plan to write a series at all. Actually, I just wanted to see if I could write a novel. And the thing is, what happened is I put so much time into developing both the detective, and I did so much research on serial killers that I was then able to spin off all these serial killers and the detective kind of actually told me how many books he needed to get through his journey. So I totally winged that part, because I just wanted to say, like, Julie, can you write a novel? And then I did, and then this other one came out, and then it turned into 3, and his story's done. But some of the other characters are interesting enough that they could have spin-offs. So we'll see what happens there. But yeah, I had absolutely no process or plan for that. I just went really deep into the characters.
We need to get better at allowing a story to end where it's supposed to end. And if there is room to continue that, by all means, continue it. And I may or may not be filming a sequel right now to a certain movie that everyone keeps asking me to make a sequel to. But one of my rules was it can't be anything like the first one. It has to be as far away as possible, because I already did that. You already watched it.
Do you feel like it's an exhale? Do you feel like it's a completion? Do you feel how do you feel when you've come to that ending?
I think you got it with exhale, when you've actually hit it, when you've actually landed it, and you know this is it. The circle has been completed. The story is done. It is and you can go on to the next.
Halfway through the book, after I'd planned it, I kind of had this revelation of like, oh, this book is me dealing with the death of my father and being the sole caretaker of him since I was 19. And so it was this real like moment of like, oh wow, this is a lot more personal than I thought it was. And especially in something, that's meant as just, your Pulp Fiction, the thing to read and, enjoy and get through pretty fast. And so it was like, the ending for that one was probably harder, because it wasn't just, that release of like, oh, I'm finished, but it was like kind of putting, the ending on this whole chapter of my own life.
I have very deep characters, and they both have big journeys, and I want the readers to care about both of them. And so my ending, usually the little bit that comes after the big climax, it's about one or both of them trying to figure something out and a way forward, and it doesn't usually go well. And so I feel sad for them, and especially because my detective is actually based on someone I've been interviewing, and it's actually a really, really sad life. And so the things that actually really end up happening to these men, these real people and women, it's just sad. And so he's trying to put his life back together and carry on, and it's really hard. And so I have cried, and I've cried for the serial killer, because can't stop, and in fact do reach out for help. It's really sad, because we have a very little grasp on how to actually, there's no way to prevent it from happening. So it happens before that he can get caught.
I love the climax. It's the denouement that I feel like is one of the hardest parts. Because you've sort of done the trick, and now you have to stick the landing. And I think that what people's expectations for that part of the story are, number one, the expectation is very high. And then number two, it's sort of like a shifting thing. And it's also every other part of the story can be natural, but the actual ending, that like last chapter, those last few paragraphs, are the complete and total opposite of natural. We don't really ever get endings in real life. The ending of every Jane Austen novel or every romance is that, oh, the guy and the girl get married, and they have babies and they live happily ever after. And then we just sort of like let them like go off into their existence and assume everything is fine. Like life is not like that. That is like just really another beginning.
Always my problem with Tolkien. Always. It's been my major problem with that stupid book. It's
I mean, it ends so many times, because it almost like how do you approach a book like that? Like I don't even know.
I'm sitting here right now dealing with the death of my respect for Joe as he bags on the Lord of the Rings. Only the greatest creative work of the 20th century. Sitting here saying, this is so fucking. All right, I'm not really going to leave, but